as strange as the African Veld. From Unto Dust by Herman Bosman. I have noticed that when a young man or woman dies, people get the feeling that there is something beautiful and touching in the event, and that it is different from the death of an old person. In the thought, say, of a girl of 20 sinking into an untimely grave, there is a sweet wistfulness that makes people talk all kinds of romantic words. She died, they say, young, she that was so full of life and so fair. She was a flower that withered before it bloomed, they say. And it all seems so fitting and beautiful that there is a good deal of resentment at the funeral over the crude questions that a couple of men in plain clothes from the Landrost's office are asking about cattle dip. But when you've grown old, nobody is very much interested in the manner of your dying. Nobody except you yourself, that is. And I think that your past life has got a lot to do with the way you feel when you get near the end of your days. I remember how, when he was lying on his deathbed, Andries Wessels kept on telling us that it was because of the blameless path he had trodden from his earliest years that he could compose himself in peace to lay down his burdens. And I certainly never saw a man breathe his last more tranquilly, seeing that right up to the end he kept on murmuring to us how happy he was, with heavenly hosts and invisible choirs of angels all around him. Just before he died, he told us that the angels had even become visible. They were medium-sized angels, he said, and they had cloven hoofs and carried forks. It was obvious that Andries Wessels' ideas were getting a bit confused by then, but all the same, I never saw a man die in a more hallowed sort of calm. Once, during the malaria season in the eastern Transvaal, it seemed to me, when I was in a high fever and likely to die, that the whole world was a big burial ground. I thought it was the earth itself that was a graveyard, and not just those little fenced-in bits of land dotted with tombstones in the shade of a Western Province oak tree or by the side of a Transvaal koppie. This was a nightmare that worried me a great deal, and so I was very glad, when I recovered from the fever, to think that we Boers had properly marked out places on our farms for people to be laid to rest in a civilized Christian way, instead of having to be buried just anyhow, along with a dead wildcat maybe, or a bushman with a clay pot and things. When I mentioned this to my friend Stoffel Oosthuizen, who was in the Low Country with me at the time, he agreed wholeheartedly. There were people who talked in a high-flown way of death as the great leveller, he said. And those high-flown people also declared that everyone was made kin by death. He would still like to see those things proved, Stoffel Oosthuizen said. After all, that was one of the reasons why the Boers had trekked away into the Transvaal and the Free State, he said. Because the British government wanted to give the vote to any Cape-coloured person walking about. The first time he heard that sort of talk, about death coming to all of us alike, and making us all equal, Stoffel Oosthuizen's suspicions were aroused. It sounded like something out of a speech made by one of those liberal Cape politicians, he explained. I found something very comforting in Stoffel Oosthuizen's words. Then, to illustrate his contention, Stoffel Oosthuizen told me a story about an incident that took place in a bygone Transvaal tribal war. I don't know whether he told the story incorrectly or whether it was just that kind of story, but by the time he had finished, all my uncertainties had, I discovered, come back to me. You can go and look at Hans Velman's tombstone any time you are at Niet-Verdiend, Stoffel Oosthuizen said. The slab of red sandstone is weathered by now, of course, seeing how long ago it all happened. But the inscription is still legible. I was with Hans Velman on that morning when he fell. Our commando had been ambushed by the tribe and was retreating. I could do nothing for Hans Velman. Once, when I looked around, I saw a tall warrior bending over him and plunging an assegai into him. Shortly afterwards, I saw the warrior stripping the clothes off Hans Velman. A yellow dog was yelping excitedly around his black master. Although I was in grave danger myself, with several dozen warriors making straight for me on foot through the bush, the fury I felt at the sight of what that tall warrior was doing made me hazard a last shot. Reining in my horse and taking what aim I could under the circumstances, I pressed the trigger. My luck was in. I saw the warrior fall forward beside the naked body of Hans Velman. Then I set spurs to my horse and galloped off at full speed, with the foremost of my pursuers already almost upon me. The last I saw was that yellow dog bounding up to his master, whom I had wounded mortally, as we were to discover later. As you know, that tribal war dragged on for a long time. There were few pitched battles. Mainly, what took place were bush skirmishes, like the one in which Hans Velman lost his life. After about 6 months, quiet of a sort was restored to the Mariku and the Soutpansberg districts. Then the day came when I went out, in the company of a handful of other burghers, to fetch the remains of Hans Velman at his widow's request, for the burial in the little cemetery plot on the farm. We took a coffin with us on a Cape cart. We located the scene of the skirmish without difficulty. Indeed, Hans Velman had been killed not very far from his own farm, which had been temporarily abandoned along with the other farms in that part during the time that the trouble lasted. We went to the spot where I remembered having seen Hans Velman lying dead on the ground, with a tall warrior next to him. From a distance, I again saw that yellow dog, At our approach, he slipped away into the bush. I could not help feeling that there was something rather stirring about that beast's fidelity, even though it was bestowed on a dead warrior. We were now confronted with a queer situation. We found that what was left of Hans Velman and the warrior consisted of little more than pieces of sun-dried flesh and the dismembered fragments of bleached skeletons. The sun and the wild animals and the birds of prey had done their work. There was a heap of human bones with, here and there, leathery strips of blackened flesh. But we could not tell which was the white man and which was the black man. To make it still more confusing, a lot of bones were missing altogether, having no doubt been dragged away by wild animals into their bushveld lairs. Another thing was that Hans Velman and that warrior had been just about the same size. Stoffel Oosthuizen paused in his narrative, and I let my imagination dwell for a moment on the situation. I realized just how those Boers must have felt about it. About the thought of bringing the remains of a Transvaal burger home to his widow for a Christian burial, and perhaps having a lot of the warrior's bones mixed up with those of the burger, lying in the same tomb on which the mauve petals from the oleander overhead would fall. I remember one of our party saying that was the worst of these tribal skirmishes, Stoffel Oosthuizen continued. If it had been a war against the English and part of a dead Englishman got lifted into that coffin by mistake, it wouldn't have mattered so much, he said. There seemed to me in this story to be something as strange as the African felt. Stoffel Oosthuizen said that the party of Boers spent almost a whole afternoon with the remains in order to try and get the white man sorted out from the black man. By evening they had laid all they could find of what seemed like Hans Velman's bones in the coffin in the Cape cart. The rest of the bones and the flesh they buried on the spot. Stoffel Oosthuizen added that no matter what the difference in the color of their skin had been, it was impossible to say that the warrior's sun-dried flesh was any blacker than the white man's. Alive, you couldn't go wrong in distinguishing between a white man and a black man. Dead, you had great difficulty in telling them apart. Naturally, we burghers felt very bitter about this whole affair, Stoffel Oosthuizen said. And our resentment was something we couldn't quite explain. Afterwards, several other men who were there that day told me that they had the same feeling of suppressed anger that I did. They wanted somebody, just once, to make a remark such as, "In death they were not divided." Then you would have seen an outburst all right. Nobody did say anything like that, however. We all knew better. 2 days later, a funeral service was conducted in the little cemetery on the Velman farm, and shortly afterwards, the sandstone memorial that you can still see there was erected. That was the story Stoffel Oosthuizen told me after I had recovered from my fever. It was a story that, as I have said, had in it features as strange as the African veld. But it brought me no peace in my broodings after that attack of malaria. Especially when Stoffel Oosthuizen spoke of how he had occasion one clear night, when the stars were shining bright, to pass that quiet graveyard on the Velman farm. Something leapt up from the mound beside the sandstone slab, Stoffel Oosthuizen said, and gave him quite a turn. It was that same yellow dog.